had walked through war zones that pretended to be cities before, but nothing prepared me for stepping into a place that pretended to be a home. The civilian blocks of Hive Varos were stacked like coffins nailed together, each one a cramped metal box pressed against thousands more. When High Command asked me to conduct a domestic condition survey, I thought it was another bureaucratic farce. I was Sergeant Darnell Reese, infantry for 17 years, veteran of 6 purges, and the kind of soldier they sent to places where diplomacy had already failed. Yet here I was, assigned to catalog the living spaces of people who had never lived without fear. The first door slid open with a reluctant groan, as though the apartment wanted to keep its secrets. A sour smell seeped out, a mix of recycled air, stale incense, and chemical cleanser used to mask mold the vents could no longer fight. I stepped inside and felt the walls close in immediately. The space was the size of a storage locker. A single cot bolted to the wall, a devotional shrine occupying half the room, and a ventilation pipe dripping condensation into a rusted pan. The shrine was brighter than anything else, the only thing with effort put into it. Candles melted down to nubs. Purity seals layered so thick the metal beneath was invisible. Someone had carved scripture into the cot frame, every line overlapping the one beneath as if trying to fit more devotion than space allowed. The civilian stood stiffly behind me, hands clasped, eyes downcast. She apologized for the mess even though there was nothing here to clutter. Her daughter slept curled on the cot, knees tucked to chest, wrapped in a thin blanket roughened by years of overwashing. The walls hummed faintly with the unending machinery of the hive, and the floor vibrated in time with the manufacturer miles below. The child stirred, startled by the tremors that she clearly considered normal. I remembered being her age, but my memories had space in them, rooms with corners, air that didn't taste recycled. She had never known that luxury. I asked her mother how long they had lived here, and she said this was the largest home they had ever had. We left that room and moved deeper into the residential stacks. The hallways were narrow, lit by lumen strips flickering like dying stars. Pipes lined every surface, hissing occasionally as pressure shifted. Civilians walked single file because there wasn't room for anything else. Many carried small shrines made from scraps, a gear wrapped in ribbon, a cogtooth carved with holy symbols, even a piece of broken machine casing that had been polished until it glimmered. They treated these objects with more tenderness than they treated themselves. Homes here were not built for comfort. They were built for obedience. Every room I entered had a shrine larger than the sleeping space, as though the hive itself dictated priorities. A family of 5 shared one cot. Their shrine had 3 tiers. I asked one man why his family slept beside exposed wiring and corroded pipes. He said it was a blessing to be so close to the hive's heartbeat. He said the machinery sang to him at night. His face twitched as he spoke, a mixture of devotion and fear. I had seen that expression before. It was the look of someone who had learned not to ask questions. Someone who believed the hive could hear them think if they dared to wonder why their life felt so small. The walls were marked with scripture scratched by fingernails, the letters uneven, carved in desperation. Every home tried to make itself holy, as though the only way to survive was to prove worth through pain. We continued, floor after floor, room after room, all identical, all suffocating. Some had broken vents spitting out cold air that made the occupants shiver. Others had vents blocked entirely, making the rooms humid and mold-grown. Yet none of the civilians complained. Complaint was a luxury reserved for people who believed someone cared enough to listen. These people did not believe that. They worshipped machines because machines did not pretend to care. Machines only required obedience. The children looked older than their years, eyes dull, shoulders slumped. They whispered prayers before eating nutrient paste that smelled like industrial solvent. I asked one boy what he prayed for. He said, "For the Emperor to make the walls bigger." It was the first honest thing anyone had said to me all day. By the 10th block, the air grew heavier. The deeper levels recycled the same oxygen for decades until it tasted metallic. The residents compensated with incense, but the scent only added to the claustrophobia. The walls sweated with condensation, dripping steadily into buckets placed beneath every pipe. Families rationed water not because it was scarce, but because the filters were. A woman showed me her son's sleeping corner, a space between two rusted support beams. He had decorated it with drawings scratched into the metal, pictures of a son he had never seen. I asked him why he drew it. He said he dreamed of warmth he couldn't describe. When I finished the survey, I stood at the end of the hall, listening to the hive breathe around me. The machinery's hum vibrated through the floor, through my boots, through my bones. I realized every home here was built not for life, but for endurance. People survived in these rooms the way soldiers survived trenches, by surrendering any part of themselves that wanted more. The hive did not kill them. It starved them of anything that might make them question whether survival was enough. On my way out, an elderly man stopped me. His eyes were bloodshot from decades of recycled air. He asked if I would tell command what I had seen. I told him yes. He shook his head and whispered that it didn't matter. Because the walls already knew. Because the hive was listening. And because in Warhammer 40K, an average home was not a place to live. It was a place to endure. The walk back through the upper residential stacks felt heavier than the descent had. The hive's tremors traveled up the metal supports like distant thunder, rattling pipes and making loose panels vibrate as if the walls themselves breathed. My escort had dwindled as civilians retreated to their units, sliding their doors shut with quiet resignation. But even behind sealed metal, I could feel their eyes lingering, watching, waiting to see if a soldier would bring change or simply bring another mandate to survive. I had performed inspections before. I had walked battlefields littered with corpses and trenches carved from mud and blood. Yet nothing weighed on me like these narrow corridors filled with the suffocation of normality. When I reached the next block assigned for survey, the door scraped open before I could knock. A man in a threadbare tunic bowed his head deeply, inviting me inside without meeting my eyes. His posture was rigid, the kind of stiffness born from fear masquerading as reverence. The apartment was as small as the others. One cot, one rusted vent, one shrine, but it held a peculiar stillness. No incense burned. No devotional seals hung from the pipes. Instead, the shrine stood unadorned, bare metal polished obsessively to a dull shine. The room smelled sterile, as though scrubbed too often with industrial cleanser. I asked if he had a family. He said he once did but offered nothing more. He sat on the edge of the cot, hands folded neatly in his lap. His fingers bore faint scars, as if he had once worn work gloves so long they had fused into his routine. He apologized for the lack of decoration, saying he had struggled to afford new purity seals after the last crackdown. His eyes flicked toward the bare shrine, and the muscles in his jaw tightened. I realized afford was the wrong word. On Hive worlds, shrines were not about price. They were about fear. Fear of being noticed. Fear of being forgotten. Fear of being questioned. I told him his room was acceptable for the report, but my reassurance only made him sit straighter, as if bracing for consequences anyway. A soft knock came from the adjoining wall. He froze. His breathing stopped. I turned, instinctively reaching for my rifle, but no threat followed. The knock repeated, 2 taps, then silence. He exhaled shakily, whispering that it was only the neighbors. In the hive, walls were thin, thinner than privacy could afford. Families lived pressed against one another, sharing walls, air, and secrets whether they wanted to or not. He said the neighbors often tapped rhythmically, not to communicate, but because it eased the anxiety of silence. In these blocks, silence was never safe. Silence meant listening. Silence meant the hive was listening back. I left him with a curt nod, though his eyes followed me with the quiet desperation of someone hoping for rescue but too afraid to ask. The next few rooms mirrored the first. Shrines dominating limited space, cots barely large enough for a body, children curled wherever there was room. One family had converted their prayer alcove into a sleeping space for their youngest, a girl so small she barely reached my knee. She peeked from behind her mother, clutching a scrap of cloth painted with a crude symbol. When I knelt to speak to her, she hid her face, whispering that soldiers meant new rules. Her mother apologized before I could reply, as though she expected punishment for her daughter's honesty. A sudden jolt shook the floor. Dust drifted from the ceiling, and distant alarms chimed faintly. The civilians didn't react. They steadied their balance automatically, adjusting their posture the way soldiers prepared for artillery strikes. Except this was no war zone. This was home. A place where children learned to sleep through tremors and adults learned to pray through malfunctions. I moved on, but the girls' whispered words sat like a stone in my chest. On the lower decks of this block, the rooms grew worse. Ventilation systems failed more frequently here, leaving the air humid and sour. Mold crept across corners, black and persistent. One man had attempted to scrape it away with a metal brush, leaving streaks of dark residue smeared down the wall. He apologized repeatedly as he showed me the result, explaining that the mold kept coming back stronger. I asked how long the vent had been broken. He said 33 years. His face didn't betray sarcasm. 33 years of malfunction. 33 years of breathing air steeped in rot and incense. The next unit contained a family of 6. They slept in shifts, 3 at a time, because there wasn't enough room for all of them to lie down simultaneously. Their shrine dominated nearly half the space, a metal structure built from scrap, shaped like a makeshift cathedral. Candles flickered beneath it despite the lack of ventilation. Their smoke gathered near the ceiling, thickening the stale air. When I asked who crafted the shrine, the eldest son stepped forward with pride. He said he built it from discarded manufacturing parts, polishing the pieces until they gleamed. His hands were burned from handling hot metal without proper tools. I asked if the shrine ever caused electrical interference. His mother stiffened. She begged me not to put that in the report. I realized then how reports shaped their lives. A single line, vent malfunction, shrine too large, wiring exposed, could condemn an entire family to relocation, fines, or worse. Homes here did not belong to the people inside them. They belonged to the Hive, and the Hive was not forgiving. Further down, I reached a corridor where lights had burned out entirely, leaving only the dull glow of candles clinging to walls. Civilians moved quietly through the dark, navigating by memory. A man with gray-streaked hair showed me his home, a space barely large enough for the cot and shrine. His wife lay asleep on the floor, skin pale beneath the candlelight. He whispered she was sick but dared not report it. There were no medical facilities here, only ration dispensers and faith. He asked if I could request a medic, but fear touched his voice before he finished. He corrected himself quickly, saying he would pray for her recovery instead. I stood at the doorway, listening to the faint sound of someone sobbing 2 rooms away. The walls conveyed everything: pain, fear, prayers, silence, all blending into one tremor of shared misery. I continued my rounds, each home chipping away pieces of my resolve. My armor felt heavier with every step. My lungs strained against the muggy air. The Hive was closing around me like a fist tightening its grip, reminding me that I could leave but these people never would. As I approached the final home on the list, the door opened before I touched it. An elderly woman stood framed in the dim hallway, her hair thin, her eyes deep-set. She gestured for me to enter without speaking. Her unit was the smallest I had seen yet. Bare metal walls with no cot, no decorations, no shrine. I frowned, glancing around. Shrines were mandatory by doctrine. Before I could comment, she sat cross-legged on the floor, folding her hands in her lap. She told me she had once served as a shrine keeper before her legs failed her. She had cared for thousands of devotional relics, each one handled with reverence. But in her old age, she gave away her relics to families with young children, believing they needed protection more than she did. Now her home was bare, stripped of religious symbols. I realized the absence was not from neglect. It was from generosity. She said she would accept any punishment my report brought. Something inside me fractured. I told her she would receive no punishment. Her eyes narrowed, studying me with a depth that made my skin prickle. She said quietly that the Hive remembers kindness differently than cruelty. She said the walls listened more closely than the administratum ever could. Then she leaned forward, voice dropping to a whisper, and asked a question that chilled me more than any battlefield ever had. "Do you hear it too?" I didn't answer. I didn't need to. The hive groaned softly, machinery humming with a rhythm too steady to be random. The air vibrated, faintly but unmistakably, like a breath drawn slowly through the ducts. She nodded knowingly, as though the walls had already spoken to her. I left her home without adding a single note to the report. At the end of the block, I paused, leaning against the cold metal, listening to the hive's pulse echo through the corridors. And for the first time, I wondered whether these homes had ever truly belonged to the people inside them, or whether they had always belonged to something else. Something patient, something ancient, something listening. The deeper I went into the habitation tiers, the more the hive's pulse settled into my bones. It wasn't a sound. Not exactly. It was a pressure behind the eardrums, a soft push every few seconds, the suggestion of a rhythm. Like the hive breathed with slow, deliberate patience. I'd felt atmospheric tremors before, manufacturum surges, reactor fluctuations, waste vent detonations, but this was none of those. This had constancy. It resembled a heartbeat, but only enough to unsettle the mind. Too steady, too calm, too aware. The next sector assigned for survey was older than the last, its corridors narrower, its metal plating darker from decades of soot and incense. The lumen strips were dim here, buzzing faintly with static. My boots clanged against grated flooring lined with oil that never fully dried. Civilians pressed themselves against the walls when I passed, murmuring ritual greetings through cracked lips. Their faces held the same exhausted hollowness I had seen in the upper stacks, but something else lingered behind their eyes. An alertness, as though waiting for a sign only they could interpret. The first door opened before I reached it. A boy no older than 12 stood inside, saluting weakly. His arms trembled from the weight of the incense box he carried. Behind him, his mother urged him back with a whisper, bowing with stiff reverence. Their unit was barely larger than a supply closet. 2 cots, one stacked above the other like coffins on rails. A rusted sink. A devotional altar made from a repurposed ration crate. The flames from their cheap candles flickered with every tremor from below. I asked the boy about the vents, a standard question, expecting the usual complaints about extreme humidity. He surprised me by answering quickly and confidently. The vents worked fine, he said, because he prayed over them each morning. His mother nodded, fearful that I might laugh. But I didn't. I had seen enough devotion to know sincerity when it flowed from desperation rather than piety. The boy believed prayer kept the air moving. For a hive like this, maybe belief was the only maintenance it ever received. I recorded the vent as functional and moved on. The next homes felt progressively heavier. Not in smell, not in humidity, though both were oppressive, but in atmosphere. Each door hit a cramped unit filled with families trying their best to appear grateful for their confinement. Shrines grew larger, overtaking more living space. One room held a shrine so expansive the cot had been folded upright against the wall, leaving almost no place to sleep. The father explained proudly that giving up space for devotion was a privilege. His children nodded along, though their eyes darted to the cot with longing. In another unit, an elderly man lay on a makeshift mat beside a malfunctioning heater that radiated dangerous heat. His skin had blistered from sleeping too close, yet he refused relocation because the shrine's placement felt right where it was. His voice shook as he described dreams where the hive whispered instructions through the walls, telling him exactly how to arrange his candles for the day. I asked what kind of dreams, trying to keep my tone neutral. He answered with reverent calm, "The dreams that protect us." He believed it. I saw no fear in him, only certainty. As I proceeded, I found myself moving slower. Not physically, though the heat and density of incense made breathing difficult, but mentally. Each home chipped at a layer of my resolve. I'd always thought fear defined hive life, but fear had simply created something deeper, something like harmony, forged under pressure so intense the people could no longer distinguish it from faith. Halfway through the block, I paused to lean against a wall. The metal felt warm under my glove. Too warm. Not from machinery, from friction, as if something beneath the plating had been shifting, grinding against the interior shell. I withdrew my hand slowly and brushed the dust off my gauntlet. The wall vibrated once more, steady, measured. I told myself it was normal structural echo, but the tremor felt deliberate. I continued. The next door opened to reveal a tall man in uniform, administrative issued gray, patched so many times the original fabric pattern was unrecognizable. He saluted sharply, introducing himself as a record keeper. His home was bigger than most, but every inch was filled with scrolls, data slates, and devotional flags hanging from the ceiling. He guided me inside with the rigid precision of someone accustomed to inspection. He told me he spent every day documenting household prayers. Yes, documenting. I frowned, and he explained calmly that the Hive required constant proof of devotion. Not officially, not by administrative mandate, but by expectation. Families submitted prayer records weekly. He sorted, archived, and returned them with stamped approval so that the residents could display the seals outside their doors. I asked what happened to those without sufficient prayer records. He fell silent, his jaw clenched. Then he whispered a phrase I never expected to hear from a clerk. The Hive takes notice. When I asked what that meant, he shook his head, eyes haunted. He gestured toward a sealed side door at the back of his unit. The metal around it appeared newer, as though repaired recently. I asked what lay beyond. He said the room had belonged to his daughter. Past tense. He said she stopped praying one night, stopped lighting incense, stopped bowing at the prescribed hours. A week later, he found her room empty. No struggle, no noise, just empty, as if the Hive had opened its mouth and swallowed her whole. I asked why he didn't report it. His hands trembled violently. Because the walls were warm, he whispered. Too warm. I left him with the weight of his unspoken fear pressing into my spine. Further down the hall, the lighting failed entirely. Civilians carried hand lamps or candles. Their shadows crawled across the walls in elongated shapes. People instinctively lowered their voices in the dark, as though something lurking beyond the light listened too closely. I passed a mother humming a quiet hymn to keep her children calm. Her voice quavered on each verse. Her hands trembled as she stroked the smallest child's hair, not from exhaustion but from fear of silence. When I entered their unit, the smell hit me first. Damp, metallic, like blood diluted in stagnant water. The walls were slick with condensation from the broken vent. The entire family slept on the floor to avoid the dripping mold overhead. Their shrine, barely recognizable, had warped under the moisture until its metal frame bent inward like a grieving figure. The mother apologized repeatedly for the state of the shrine, explaining she tried to repair it but lacked tools. She asked if the emperor would forgive her for its condition. Her voice was so small, so fragile, that for a moment I forgot I was a soldier. I told her the emperor did not measure devotion by metal or candles. She wept softly at those words, wiping her tears quickly so they wouldn't fall onto the shrine. When I stepped back into the corridor, the Hive tremor returned. But this time, it wasn't the same rhythm. It pulsed twice, slow, steady, then paused. Then a third pulse deeper than before, as if something large shifted beneath the metal layers of the Hive. Something that had grown aware of movement in its upper structure. I stood still, listening. The civilians froze as well, heads tilting in unison. For a moment, no one breathed. The corridor vibrated a final time, a low thrum that rolled through the piping like a whisper carried by steel. A child near me asked her mother what the Hive had said. Her mother shushed her violently, not out of fear of punishment, but out of fear of being overheard. I finished the survey of the block, though the last few rooms blurred together. Shrine after shrine, cot after cot, families squeezing into spaces carved from misery. Some tried to smile. Most did not. All of them carried the same subtle tension in their shoulders, as if bracing for a blow they expected daily. As I prepared to leave, a loud clang echoed through the corridor. Pipes rattled. Dust shook free. Civilians pressed themselves into doorways, whispering fevered prayers. My hand fell to my rifle. The tremor that followed was long. Too long. Like something dragging itself along the interior shell of the hive. Then silence. Complete, unnatural silence. Every lumen strip flickered off in the same instant. In the dark, I felt dozens of breaths hitch. The hive was listening, waiting. When the lights finally returned, something in the corridor had changed. The scripture etched along the walls, scratched by countless fingernails over decades, was gone. All of it. Every line, every scratch, every desperate prayer carved into metal. The walls were perfectly smooth, as though they had been wiped clean, or swallowed. A child cried softly. A woman fainted. A man screamed a single word before biting his fist to stop himself from saying more. For the first time since entering the living stacks, I understood the truth. The average home in Warhammer 40K was not just a place where people lived. It was a place where the hive reminded them who owned them. And tonight, the hive had decided to speak. The moment the walls turned smooth, the corridor seemed to inhale. I felt the pressure shift, a subtle tightening of the stale air, as though the hive itself drew in a long, deliberate breath. Civilians stood paralyzed, their eyes wide, their bodies rigid. No one dared speak. Even the children, who had moments earlier whispered questions with unthinking innocence, fell silent. The hive's machinery, normally a constant backdrop of clanks, hisses, and mechanical murmurs, went dead. The stillness pressed against my skull like a closing fist. I took one step forward. The metal floor groaned beneath my boot, a low, resonant noise that echoed far too loudly in the corridor. Faces turned toward me in fear, as if the simple act of moving had broken a rule they all understood but I did not. I felt their terror cling to me like cold sweat. They weren't afraid of me. They were afraid of whatever listened through the walls. My hand tightened instinctively on my rifle, though I knew it was useless against a structure the size of a continent. Still, holding the weapon steadied me, even if the comfort was a lie. I knelt and touched the newly smooth wall. The metal was warm, warmer than any surface should have been, as though something pulsed just beneath the plating. The heat radiated through my glove and into my palm, carrying a faint vibration that matched the rhythm I had been feeling all day. But now the rhythm was stronger, more defined. It wasn't random machinery. It wasn't atmospheric pressure. It wasn't structural settling. It was intent, a deliberate pulse, a signal, a heartbeat. Behind me, a civilian whispered a prayer, voice trembling. Another corrected her, insisting the words be spoken precisely. Their voices clashed, fear overriding devotion, and the argument grew louder. Before I could intervene, the wall beside them shuddered violently. Both civilians froze mid-sentence, breath caught in their throats. A thin crack formed along the metal, splitting it with a hiss. They backed away slowly, pressing against the opposite wall, eyes filled with a terror so raw it tightened my own chest. The crack widened for a heartbeat, then sealed itself smoothly, leaving no mark. The civilians collapsed to their knees, begging forgiveness. For what, I didn't know, but they believed the hive had punished them for speaking out of turn. I wanted to tell them the hive didn't care about minor infractions. But the more I watched, the more I realized I was wrong. The hive cared deeply, just not in any human sense. As I moved deeper into the block, the changes multiplied. Scripture vanished from walls as I approached. Fresh carvings dissolved like dust. Candles extinguished themselves. Doors unlocked with soft clicks, sliding open even when no one touched them. Civilians huddled in corners, clutching children, watching with hollow eyes. They whispered that the hive was awake. Not metaphorically awake, listening, judging. It wasn't superstition anymore. Not after watching the walls reconfigure themselves without a sound. One woman grabbed my gauntlet as I passed her doorway. Her fingers trembled, nails cracked and blackened from years of labor. She begged me not to go farther, saying the lower chambers had already begun answering people. When I asked what she meant, she said some neighbors received knocks on their doors at night. Not from outside, but from inside the walls. Those who opened their doors found the corridors empty. Those who didn't open their doors stopped being neighbors. Her voice broke as she added that her husband had stopped knocking weeks ago. I continued downward, though every instinct screamed at me to turn back. The hive's pulse grew louder. The vents exhaled warm air in rhythmic bursts, matching the beat. Doors clicked open as I walked past, revealing cramped spaces lit only by candles. Civilians inside stared at me with a mixture of awe and dread. They whispered that the hive wanted something from me. I dismissed it as superstition, but even I didn't believe my own denial. At the next junction, I encountered a malfunctioning lumen that flickered with frantic intensity. A maintenance worker attempted to fix it, but every time he touched the wires, the lumen straightened and glowed brightly, only to die again when he stepped back. He muttered that the hive didn't want it lit. I told him to keep working, but the moment he lifted his tool, the lumen sparked violently, sending a burst of electricity into the ceiling. He recoiled, terrified, and threw his tools into a corner. He refused to try again. I moved on. A few rooms later, I found a small gathering of civilians kneeling silently in a circle. A single candle burned between them, surrounded by dozens of broken incense sticks arranged like ribs around a heart. They swayed gently, eyes closed, murmuring to the metal floor beneath them. The leader, a thin man with sunken cheeks, lifted his gaze when I approached. He smiled a tired smile and said they were apologizing for drawing attention. Attention from what? He pointed upward. The ceiling trembled. I stepped back just as dust rained down. Several long dents appeared overhead, slow and deliberate, as though fingers pressed from above. The ceiling sank inward a few inches before retracting. The group gasped and bowed low, forehead to metal. I reached for my Vox bead to call command, but the signal crackled with static. The hive's interference had intensified. It didn't want my message sent. I continued deeper, feeling more like prey than soldier. At the end of the block, I reached a sealed maintenance door. A warning sigil was painted across it, fresh paint, still wet. The shape was unfamiliar. Not imperial, not devotional, something else. Something curved and flowing, like a symbol drawn by a hand that didn't understand straight lines. A faint vibration came from behind the door. Slow, rhythmic, powerful. I tried to open it. The door didn't just refuse to budge. Pushed back. A single, heavy thump struck the metal from the inside, rattling the bolts. I staggered backward, heart pounding. Another thump followed. Then another, each perfectly timed, each stronger. The civilians behind me fell to their knees, whispering desperate prayers. I stood frozen, staring at the door as the dents grew deeper, metal bowing outward like a drum stretched too tight. The hive was no longer whispering. It was knocking, calling, asking to be let out. I backed away slowly, rifle raised though it felt absurd. Doors along the corridor opened as I passed, revealing civilians watching with silent terror. None asked what happened. None wanted to know. They already believed the hive had chosen a new path. And for the first time, I feared they were right. Because the average home in Warhammer 40K wasn't built for the living. It was built for the hive. And tonight, the hive wanted space to grow. By the time I reached the mid-tier lift shaft, the hive had fully awakened. Not metaphorically, not spiritually. The metal around me vibrated like muscle beneath skin. The lights along the corridor throbbed in slow intervals, pulsing in sync with the same heavy rhythm I had felt through the walls earlier. Civilians crowded in doorways, afraid to move, afraid to speak. Their eyes followed me with mute desperation, as though I alone could bargain with the thing that held their world together. It was a lie they needed to believe. I felt none of that strength inside myself. My nerves buzzed like frayed wiring. The lift stuttered when I hit the call rune. Sparks trickled down the shaft. When the cage finally arrived, its metal grate was warped, the entire frame leaning as if pushed from the inside. I stepped in anyway. The cage lurched downward, the gears grinding in protest. As I descended, the walls of the shaft pressed closer, the space narrowing until the lift scraped its sides. Dust rained down. I forced myself to breathe steadily, though every instinct screamed to pry the gate open and climb back up the cables. Halfway down, the lift stopped without warning. The lights dimmed to a faint orange glow. I tapped the control panel. It flickered, then died. The temperature rose sharply inside the cage, beads of sweat forming beneath my armor seals. The air vibrated with that rhythmic pulse, slow, deliberate, expectant. I put my hand against the lift wall, felt warm, warmer than before, like something massive exhaled behind the plating. A deep thud echoed through the shaft. Not machinery, not failure. A knock. I froze. Another knock followed, louder, closer. Metal dust drifted from the far wall and floated in the choking air. The entire lift trembled. When the next knock came, it sounded less like an impact and more like a hand the size of a transport tank tapping its fingers thoughtfully against metal. Something was testing the walls, testing where the people were. I pried open the grate with brute force and climbed out into the half-lit maintenance tier. My boots landed on grated flooring slick with condensation and oil. The corridor stretched in both directions, lined with pipes that sweated rust and heat. Steam curled upward in thin tendrils, carrying the taste of metal. Behind me, the lift groaned. I turned just long enough to see the cage deform slightly, as though squeezed by something invisible. I didn't wait to see more. I moved. The maintenance tier housed no residents. Only equipment rooms, duct access, and old storage bays stripped bare years ago. But as I advanced, I heard something impossible. Whispering. Dozens of voices whispering in overlapping tones. The sound seeped through the vents, rising and falling in a pattern too rhythmic to be human speech. I slowed my pace and followed the sound through a side passage where the metal walls bulged inward in unnatural curves. A faint glow emanated from the floor ahead. When I rounded the corner, I found a cluster of civilians kneeling in the middle of a maintenance junction. Their faces were gaunt, their skin damp with sweat. They whispered as one, eyes closed, bodies trembling. In front of them, the floor plating had peeled upward like a lid, revealing a cavity beneath. Warm air rose from it. Something pulsed inside the cavity, casting a dull green light across their faces. A child kneeled among them, a girl no older than 8. Her small hands rested on the torn metal, fingers twitching with each pulse coming from below. Her lips moved silently, following the rhythm. I approached slowly. The civilians didn't react, too absorbed in whatever trance held them. I crouched next to the cavity. A mass of living tissue pulsed beneath the floor, veins coursing through metal as if the hive's infrastructure had grown organs. They expanded and contracted with slow regularity, pushing heat through the ducts. The tissue crawled up the support beams like vines, gripping metal with fleshy tendrils. The hive wasn't just alive, it was growing. I reached out and touched the girl's shoulder. She jerked back violently, as if waking from a nightmare. Her eyes widened with panic. She told me, between shuddering breaths, that the hive had been speaking all night, whispering through the walls, through the pipes, through their dreams. Her mother tried to pull her away from the cavity, but the girl resisted, staring at the pulsing mass with something like sadness. She said it didn't want to hurt them. It just wanted room. Room to expand. Room to breathe. I told them all to step back. They obeyed, though reluctantly. I tried to radio command, but my vox returned nothing but static. The hive's interference was total now. The air vibrated with each pulse from the mass below, the rhythm growing stronger, louder, almost impatient. I followed the maintenance route deeper. Every corridor held signs of transformation. Pipes bent at unnatural angles, their joints flexing as though adjusting to something swelling beneath them. Vents exhaled warm breath in slow, measured bursts. Panels bulged and receded like lungs. The hive was no longer content to hide its life. It was shedding the pretense of steel and becoming something else entirely. When I reached the end of the tier, I found a metal door bent outward, its hinges torn free. Beyond it lay a small residential annex. Families huddled near their doorways, embracing children, clutching one another with white-knuckled hands. Their shrines flickered weakly, candles struggling against the rising heat. A man rushed to me, pleading for evacuation, insisting the walls had started moving around them. He gestured frantically to the corridor behind him. The walls were breathing, subtle but undeniable. The metal expanded and contracted slowly, almost hypnotically. Scripture etched along the panels shifted like written flesh, the letters bending with each inhale. Doors shuddered in their frames. The lights flickered with the wall's rhythm. I reached out to touch the metal. It was hot, too hot. A long groan echoed through the annex. The residents screamed, rushing into the open space to escape the trembling of their homes. The ground heaved beneath them. One of the doors buckled inward as the wall behind it pushed forward, metal bending like skin pressed from the inside. Civilians scattered, dragging children away as the panel cracked, revealing a pulsating layer beneath, living tissue woven with machinery. The Hive's patience had ended. One woman screamed that the Hive wanted to reclaim space, that it wanted to rearrange itself, that homes were in its way. I grabbed her arm and pulled her toward the nearest stairs. "It's not rearranging," I said, breath ragged. "It's growing." A deeper thrum rolled through the floor, knocking several people off their feet. The homes twisted, cots toppled, shrines cracked, metal peeled back like rotting bark. Families fled their units, screaming as the walls folded, reshaped, widened. Rooms collapsed inward as new chambers formed. The Hive was expanding, reconfiguring, making room for whatever it intended to become. A young man tried to run back into his home for a sibling. I caught him before he reached the doorway, but the wall sealed behind his sister faster than either of us could react. Smooth metal fusing with a final hiss. He screamed into my chest. I held him as the Hive swallowed the last gap. When the annex finally stopped shaking, the walls had reshaped into new patterns. Smooth, curved, pulsing faintly. Homes were gone. Only cavities remained. A man whispered, voice hollow with horror that felt too large to process. "This is what it looks like when a Hive world sheds its skin." I stared at the new chamber, heart hammering, sweat dripping inside my armor. I had seen tyrannid digestion pools, chaos-tainted spires, demon-infested shrines. Nothing prepared me for a Hive doing this on its own. I felt the vibration again, stronger now, rising from far below. The homes had not merely been reclaimed. They had been digested, consumed, and the Hive wanted more. The annex did not remain silent for long. The new chamber kept pulsing, slow, deliberate, like a creature adjusting to its new shape. Each contraction pushed warm air through the corridor, carrying the metallic tang of fresh blood and the sour sting of overheated machinery. Families huddled near the stairwell, clutching children, whispering frantic prayers. Their voices trembled like candle flames in open wind. My own pulse thudded painfully against my throat, the Hive's rhythm fighting to sync with my heartbeat. I forced myself to breathe through it. Soldiers learned to ignore pain, but ignoring a world's intention was something else entirely. I told the survivors to follow me. Not because I knew where safety waited, there was no such place left, but because they needed direction, and direction kept panic at bay. We ascended the stairwell, the metal steps vibrating beneath our weight. The temperature rose with each level. The Hive was overheating, not from malfunction but from exertion. It was birthing something, reshaping itself with purpose, with will. A normal world might collapse under stress. Hive Varos was reorganizing. On the next floor, the corridor lights flickered violently. The bulbs burst one by one, showering us with sparks. Civilians screamed and pressed themselves against me, against each other, against anything solid. A deep groan rolled through the walls, a sound like metal grinding against bone. I raised a hand to steady them, but even my own fingers trembled. The walls bulged outward, stretching like fabric under strain. Scripture carved into the metal twisted into unrecognizable shapes, curved strokes, flowing lines, symbols that belonged to no imperial dialect. A door ahead of us rattled. Then the hinges tore free, and the door slammed inward as something behind it pushed. A rush of hot air blasted through the gap, carrying with it a low, monstrous exhalation. Civilians screamed. I shoved them back, rifle raised out of reflex rather than strategy. The wall continued to bulge, metal flexing like ribs under immense pressure. Then the bulge receded, quickly, smoothly, as if satisfied with its growth. I backed away slowly, guiding the survivors around the warped doorframe. They moved like ghosts, silent, trembling, eyes hollow. Some clutched small shrines or charms against their chests, knuckles white. Others whispered the same prayer repetitively, the words dissolving into sobs. A boy tugged at my gauntlet. He asked if the Hive was angry. I told him no. The truth was worse. The Hive wasn't angry at all. It was hungry. We reached the mid-tier promenade, a long balcony overlooking a drop into the deeper industrial levels. Below, the manufactorum roared with unnatural intensity. Steam billowed upward through wide cracks in the floor, glowing faintly green. Massive pistons pounded in erratic rhythm. Conveyors moved without purpose, jerking like tendons firing impulsively. The noise blended into a single deafening tone that rattled the railing. People had gathered here in the hundreds. Families, workers, priests clutching censers that spat sparks. They knelt along the walkway, facing the open chasm, swaying in unison. Their chants echoed upward, merging with the Hive's pulse. Some cried, some smiled with eerie serenity. Many looked hollow, their minds fractured by the transformation around them. When they saw me, the crowd parted in a ripple, as though guided by unseen instruction. Their eyes tracked me with devotion I did not want. A preacher with half-burned robes stumbled forward. His voice cracked from screaming litany. He cried that the Hive was revealing its true form, that the Emperor had blessed it with awakening, that those who survived would become part of its sanctity. His arms trembled as he reached toward me, grasping desperately for my approval. Behind him, the metal floor buckled upward. A long, sinuous shape rose from beneath the promenade. Machinery fused with living tissue, thick cables wrapped like muscle fibers. It pulsed with each beat of the Hive's rhythm. Civilians fell to their knees in awe. Priests sobbed with joy. The preacher raised both arms and cried that the Hive had chosen its shepherd. I fired. The shot tore through the growth, splattering biometal across the floor. The crowd screamed. The preacher shrieked in outrage. The entity recoiled, slamming against the balcony with a heavy, metallic thud before withdrawing into the chasm. The walkway shook violently. Chunks of stone fell into the abyss below. I ordered civilians to run, but many refused, clawing at my armor, begging me not to hurt their blessing. The Hive thrashed beneath us, shaking the promenade loose from its supports. I grabbed the closest civilians and forced them toward the stairs. A few obeyed. Many did not. Some leapt willingly into the chasm, arms spread in rapture, their voices swallowed by the roar below. Others clung to the railing until it tore free, their bodies tumbling with the metal into darkness. I pulled a young mother and her child toward the stairwell as the floor behind us split open. A hot blast of air threw several people off their feet. The promenades above and below buckled like bending spine. I shielded the child with my body as a shower of debris rained down, metal shards embedding themselves in my armor. The Hive roared, a sound so deep it pressed tears from my eyes. It wasn't reacting to pain. It was exerting itself, growing, expanding, changing. We reached the stairwell only moments before the entire walkway gave way behind us. The crash of collapsing metal echoed through the Hive like a death sentence. On the next level, the changes escalated. Homes had fused into one another, walls melted, shrines absorbed into new metal growths, cots crushed into warped corners. Civilians wandered in dazed silence, trapped in corridors that no longer followed linear architecture. The Hive was rewriting itself. Rooms turned sideways. Hallways looped into spirals. Staircases ended abruptly in fleshy masses that pulsed like living tissue. A man begged me to help him find his wife. I asked where she'd last been. He pointed at a wall that was no longer a wall, just a smooth surface with a faint imprint beneath, like a face pressed against the metal from the inside. I pulled him away before he lost what sanity he had left. As we moved, I realized none of this was random. The hive wasn't collapsing. It was evolving. Every change served a purpose. Every shift responded to stimuli, sound, movement, fear. It reacted intelligently, adaptively. It wasn't a structure anymore. It was a mind. And it wanted its residents to stop pretending they lived inside it. It wanted them back. We reached the transport shaft to the upper levels. The doors were jammed, warped by the hive's growth. I tore at the panels with my gauntlets, forcing the gap wider until there was enough space for the mother to slip through with her child. I pushed civilians through one by one, the metal scraping their backs. When I tried to climb through, the shaft trembled. The walls closed in slightly, just enough to make the gap narrow. The hive pulsed once, hard. The message was unmistakable. Leave the civilians. But not me. I shoved my shoulder through anyway. The metal tore at my armor. The hive thrummed angrily, the pulse rising like a warning. Before it could react again, I pulled myself through and slammed the manual lock. The survivors clung to each other, shaking, weeping. Their homes were gone, their world unrecognizable. One of them whispered, "What is happening to our planet?" I wanted to tell them the truth, that their hive had stopped being a hive long ago, that the devotional architecture, the rituals, the prayers, the suffering, the generational fear had not been absorbed by doctrine. They had been absorbed by the walls. Instead, I simply said, "Run." As we fled upward toward the landing spires, the hive roared behind us. Steel twisted. Floors reformed. Doors slammed shut. It wasn't destroying itself. It was reclaiming ownership. And as the last stairwell shook beneath my boots, I understood the final truth. Homes in Warhammer 40K were never meant to shelter people. They were meant to shelter the hive. And tonight, the hive had remembered that.